Hello, dear members of the Soul Stories family. Today we will bring you a romantic love story, so let's get started. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any meaningful stories. Chapter 1. A Fated Encounter. On a freezing night in Chicago, the sound of an ambulance siren echoed through the deserted streets, blending with the patter of raindrops on the roof of the central hospital. Inside the emergency room, the atmosphere was stifling, like a chaotic painting. Cold, white fluorescent lights flickered, the heart monitor beeped urgently, and the shouts of medical staff rang out amidst the storm of the crisis. A stretcher was rushed in, its wheels rolling across the floor with a shrill squeak, like the cry of a lost soul. On the stretcher lay Mia Anderson, 27 years old, her brown hair matted with blood, her white shirt soaked red after a car accident less than an hour ago. Her eyes were tightly shut, her face pale, but her lips still moved faintly, as if trying to cling to something precious on the fragile boundary between life and death. A medical staff member, a young man with a tense face, pushed the stretcher while shouting, "Female, 27 years old, traffic accident, severe blood loss, blood pressure dropping fast." Mia lay there, her breathing faint, each breath like a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. But amidst the pain, her lips trembled, whispering something no one could hear clearly. A nearby nurse leaned down, trying to catch the faint sound, but then shook her head. "She's delirious." At the center of the room, Dr. James Jim Marshall, 30 years old, stood like a statue amidst the storm. His deep blue eyes were sharp and cold, his angular face devoid of emotion, his hands in a white lab coat moving swiftly yet precisely. He was the Ice King, a nickname the entire hospital had given him for his aloofness that made him unapproachable. No one had ever seen him smile. No one dared ask about his personal life, and coffee invitations from nurses were always rebuffed with an icy stare. But tonight, he was the one directing the emergency team, his low, firm voice cutting through. "Check her airway, transfuse O-type blood, prepare for a CT scan immediately." Jim leaned down to examine Mia, placing the stethoscope on her chest to listen to her faint heartbeat. Suddenly, in her delirium, Mia whispered, her voice trembling but full of emotion, "Jim, don't leave me. I need you." The small sound was like a pebble dropping into a still lake, silencing the room for a fleeting moment. Nurse Lily, a blonde girl with curious round eyes, stood beside Jim and whipped around to look at him, her mouth agape. "Did she just call your name?" Jim's hands froze, his eyes flickering briefly, a tiny crack in the icy facade he always wore. But he quickly regained his composure, his voice stern. "I don't know her." But Mia didn't stop. Her breathing grew weaker, yet her lips kept moving, as if her heart was trying to say what her body no longer had the strength for. "Jim, stay with me this time." The whisper wasn't loud, but it pierced through the noise of the machines, reaching everyone in the room. Lily looked at Jim, her eyes full of suspicion. "Dr. Marshall, are you sure you don't know her? She's calling your name like you're someone she can't lose." Rumors began to spread amid the hushed murmurs of the medical staff. "How could he have a girlfriend with that cold personality?" a young nurse whispered, holding a tray of instruments. "Who is this girl calling his name in her dreams like that?" Another staff member replied, eyes fixed on Mia. "The Ice King has a secret. I bet he's hiding some love story." A different voice chimed in, half joking, half serious. Jim heard it all but didn't respond. He frowned, his hands continuing their work, cutting Mia's shirt to check her wounds, bandaging swiftly with the precision of a seasoned doctor. "Prepare to take her to the operating room," he ordered, his voice unwavering. But in his mind, a question flashed. Who is this Jim she's calling? He didn't know this girl, didn't know who she was, and couldn't understand why her faint voice made his heart, frozen for so long, stir faintly. As he looked down at Mia's pale face, her lips still moving faintly in delirium, he felt a strange sensation, as if she were pulling him into a memory he'd never lived. Lily, unable to curb her curiosity, whispered to a colleague, "She's calling his name like he's her whole world. But look at Dr. Marshall. His face is stone cold, like he's been wrongly accused and won't even bother to explain." The colleague chuckled softly. Maybe it's fate. I want to know what happened to this girl. Mia remained there, her breathing growing ever fainter. As the fourth needle was inserted into her arm, she mumbled one last thing before sinking into darkness. Jim, I just want you to stay. Her voice faded, like a plea dissolving into the air. A nurse nearby shook her head, her tone low and somber. She's holding on to someone, but maybe it's not anyone here. Jim stood still for a second, holding the patient status chart, his gaze lingering on Mia's face longer than usual. He didn't know why, but her whisper, Jim, stay with me this time, echoed in his mind, like a sad melody he couldn't shake. He turned away, commanding, take her to the OR, now. But as the emergency room doors closed, he couldn't stop himself from glancing back at her one last time, a strange feeling creeping into his heart, as if fate had just knocked on his door. The murmurs continued behind him. Lily crossed her arms, watching Jim's retreating figure. I don't believe he doesn't know her. If not, then this is a love story that hasn't even started, but already makes you curious. Another nurse whispered. She called his name in her delirium, like her soul found him before they even met. Outside, the rain still fell, each droplet striking the glass windows like a soundtrack to the fateful moment that had just unfolded. Mia Anderson, a girl with a broken heart fighting to survive, had unwittingly drawn Dr. Jim Marshall, the cold ice king, into a story he never expected. The audience was pulled into the questions. Who is the Jim she's calling? What made her whisper his name in her delirium? And why, on the brink of life and death, did two strangers seem destined to meet? Chapter 2. A Shattered Past. Chicago in autumn, a few hours before Mia Anderson was rushed into the emergency room, covered in blood and tears. Golden leaves fell slowly onto the narrow street, like silent fragments of memory drifting away from her. A cold breeze wove through Mia's soft brown hair as she sat in Brewhaven, facing Jim Carter, the man she had loved for 6 years. The small cafe was warm with soft yellow lighting and the faint aroma of latte lingering in the air. But between the two of them, an invisible void was growing, as cold as an early winter gust. Mia, 27 years old, a talented marketing manager with a solid career, always carried a warm heart and simple dreams. But now she felt her heart stop as she looked into the unfamiliar eyes of the man she once saw as her entire world. Jim Carter, 32 years old, a successful lawyer with sleek, combed-back hair in an expensive suit, sat across from her, his hands clasped on the table as if preparing to read a contract. For 6 years together, Mia had poured her youth into loving and sacrificing for him. She had once said to him on an autumn evening a few months ago, as they sat by the window of her apartment, with the city lights twinkling in the distance, Jim, I don't need much. Just you by my side. Just don't leave me. Her voice was gentle, full of trust, and he had nodded, holding her hand like a promise. But today his eyes were icy, devoid of the warmth from that day. He cleared his throat and spoke in an even, emotionless tone. Mia, I think we should end this. I need someone more suitable. His words cut through Mia's heart like a frigid wind. She froze, her eyes widening as she looked at him, her hands trembling around her latte cup. 6 years of love, the late nights she waited for him with a cold meal, the times she smiled past suspicious messages on his phone, all turned to nothing. She fought back tears, forcing a weak smile, her voice breaking. More suitable? Does that mean I'm not good enough? The question wasn't meant to blame. It was a cry from a heart shattering inside her. She wanted him to say it was just a fleeting impulse, that he still loved her as she had loved him, with everything she had. But Jim didn't answer her question. He sighed, his gaze shifting away. Mia, I don't want to argue. I just want to be honest. I've met someone else, and she suits me better. His confession was a second knife, deeper and more painful. Mia felt her chest tighten, her breathing labored. She wanted to scream, to ask him why, but all she could do was sit there, gripping her coffee cup so hard her knuckles turned white. Someone else, she mumbled, her voice choked. So all these years, what was I to you? A placeholder until you found someone better? Jim stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with an impatient air. Mia, don't make this complicated. I'm leaving. He turned and walked out the door, not once looking back, leaving her there with a cold latte and a broken heart. Mia watched his retreating figure, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She whispered in despair, Jim, I tried so hard. Why didn't you see? But he was gone, abandoning her with a wordless pain. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him forever. Mia leapt up, grabbed her purse, and rushed out of the cafe, tears blurring her vision. Outside, Jim had climbed into his sleek black Audi, the car starting to pull away onto the busy street. Mia shouted, her voice breaking with anguish. Jim, come back! Please! She ran after the car, her high heels clacking on the sidewalk, her hair whipping in the cold wind. Jim, don't go! I can't live without you! She called, her voice faltering, tears streaming endlessly. She didn't care about the curious stares from passers-by or the drizzle beginning to fall. She just wanted him to turn back, to see how her heart had shattered for him. But Jim didn't stop. He accelerated, his face expressionless behind the glass. In her desperation, Mia darted into the street, screaming one last time, Jim, please, come back! She didn't see the red light flash at the intersection ahead. She didn't hear the screeching brakes of the delivery truck speeding from the left. A horrific crash tore through the peaceful autumn afternoon. Mia's body was flung into the air, spinning once before crashing onto the pavement, like the last golden leaf falling from a branch. Her purse flew aside, her expensive phone, a gift she'd bought herself after a big project, rolled to the curb, its screen shattered. Blood pooled from her head, mingling with the rain, forming a dark red streak on the cold asphalt. In the fading moment of consciousness, Mia felt her body lighten, as if all her pain were dissolving with the warm blood. She thought, her inner voice weak but full of emotion, if losing you is fate, at least I loved you with all my heart. Her eyes closed, a final tear rolling down, blending with the rain. She no longer had the strength to call his name, but her broken heart still beat its last beats for him. Far off, Jim's Audi disappeared around a corner, oblivious to what had happened. Passers-by gathered around Mia, panicked shouts ringing out, someone dialing 911. A middle-aged woman shook her head, her voice choked. She ran after her lover and ended up like this. Poor thing. A teenage boy picked up Mia's employee ID that had fallen from her bag, murmuring, Mia Anderson. She must have loved someone so much. The pain of betrayal, which had burned like a fire in her heart at the cafe, was now overshadowed by the horrific crash. But in that moment on the edge of death, she didn't regret loving with all she had, only that the one she loved never turned back. Chapter 3. The Misunderstanding Spreads. In the days following the accident, Central Chicago Hospital became a small world filled with whispers and curious glances. The intensive care unit, where Mia Anderson lay, was the epicenter of relentless rumors. Cold white light shone down on her hospital bed, where she remained motionless, her brown hair spilling over the pillow like delicate threads. The heart monitor beeped steadily, but each beat seemed to carry a longing she couldn't voice. Mia was still lost in a coma, her body frail after a lengthy surgery, yet her lips occasionally twitched, murmuring words only her heart understood. Dr. James Jim Marshall, dubbed the Ice King of the hospital, entered the ICU with his familiar demeanor. A pristine white lab coat, sharp cold eyes, and hands moving swiftly as he checked the patient's condition. He was a dedicated doctor, but so aloof that no one dared ask him anything beyond work matters. Every time he came to check on Mia, the room's atmosphere grew heavier, not because of his sternness, but because of what she said in her delirium. That day, as Jim stood beside Mia's bed, inspecting her IV line, she stirred faintly. Her cracked, dry lips parted slightly, and a feeble whisper escaped. Jim, don't go. Her voice was small, trembling, like a plea from the depths of her heart. Jim paused, his hand freezing midair, a flicker of surprise passing through his deep blue eyes. Nurse Lily, who always shadowed him during shifts, stood nearby and immediately turned to him, her round eyes wide with astonishment. She's calling your name again, Doctor. Marshall. Jim frowned, his voice as firm as ever. I'm not the one she's calling for. He resumed his work, checking Mia's heart rate on the monitor, but his hand tightened around the pen in his coat pocket, a subtle sign few noticed. Lily tilted her head, unable to hide her curiosity. But she keeps saying Jim every time you're here. Isn't that too much of a coincidence? The rumors began to spread from that moment. The medical staff, always eager for a splash of color in their long, stressful days, didn't miss the chance to whisper among themselves. They avoided saying Jim Marshall's name in front of Mia, as if silently agreeing not to rouse her from her coma, but this only let the misunderstanding grow naturally. Each time Jim entered the room, Mia would whisper, "Jim, stay with me." And those words were like an invisible arrow, piercing through the icy shield around him, though he refused to acknowledge it. One afternoon, as Jim checked the bandage on Mia's shoulder, she mumbled again, "Jim, don't go. I need you." Her voice was faint but carried a profound sadness, as if she were clinging to a figure long gone. An older nurse, Helen, standing nearby, sighed softly. "She calls your name like you're her whole world, Doctor." Marshall. Even if you're not that person, it's enough to soften anyone's heart. Jim didn't reply, silently gazing down at Mia's pale face. His eyes, usually sharp and cold, now held a hint of tenderness, a small shift he himself didn't recognize. In the staff break room, conversations about Mia and Jim grew livelier. A young nurse, Sarah, stirred her coffee and said to Lily, "She calls his name in her dreams, like her soul knew him before they even met. Could this be fate?" Lily shrugged, smiling faintly. "I don't know, but if Dr. Marshall had a girlfriend, the whole hospital would be shocked. He's so cold." Another staff member chimed in. "Cold for sure, but he's never skipped a shift with her. Something's odd about that." Jim overheard these murmurs but chose silence. He dismissed every suspicion. "I don't know her. She's delirious, that's all." But each time he stepped into Mia's room, each time he heard her whisper his name, a strange feeling crept into his heart, as if she were calling him, not someone else. He told himself it was just a silly coincidence, that the Jim in her words was another person, a shadow from a past he had no part in. But why? Whenever she said, "Don't go," did his heart stir faintly, as if he wanted to stay? One late night, when the hospital was steeped in silence, Jim stood alone by Mia's bedside. He checked her breathing, his gaze lingering on her delicate face, now marked with scars. She stirred slightly, and this time her voice was a bit clearer. "Jim, can you hear me? Don't leave me." The whisper was like an invisible thread, drawing him into a world he'd never known. He stood still, his hand resting lightly on the bed's edge, his eyes softening. He didn't know why, but the sincerity in her voice, even unconscious, made it impossible for him to remain indifferent. Lily, passing by, caught the scene through a crack in the door. She whispered to herself, "I've never seen Dr. Marshall look at anyone like that. Maybe he doesn't even realize his heart is melting." She turned away, leaving Jim there, alone with emotions he'd never acknowledged. The misunderstanding continued to spread through the hospital, but no one knew the truth, that the Jim in Mia's heart was Jim Carter, the ex-lover who had betrayed her, not Jim Marshall. Yet with each of Mia's whispers, the distance between her and Jim Marshall seemed to shrink, not through words or actions, but through an invisible thread of fate. The staff began to believe that, no matter how much Jim denied it, he had unwittingly become part of her story. A story that began with pain, but might lead to something more beautiful. Outside the window, a faint moonlight filtered through the glass, illuminating Mia's face and Jim's tall silhouette. He stood there silent, his eyes fixed on her. He wondered, who is she? And why can't I look away from her? The answer remained a mystery, but in that moment, the frozen heart of the Ice King began to feel its first warmth, from a girl he didn't know, yet seemed destined to meet. Chapter 4. An Unexpected Conversation. 3 days had passed since the horrific accident. Like an endless dream, Mia Anderson couldn't escape. In the intensive care unit of Central Chicago Hospital, gentle light slipped through the white curtains from the window, illuminating her pale face. The heart monitor beeped steadily, each beat a testament that she had crossed the boundary between life and death. Mia lay there, her body frail, her eyes shut tight for 3 days. But now her eyelids fluttered faintly, like a butterfly preparing to emerge from its cocoon. Dr. James Jim Marshall entered the room as always, with his familiar cold demeanor. His deep blue eyes scanned the patient status chart, his hands in the white lab coat checking the IV line with the precision of a seasoned doctor. He was the ice king of the hospital, a figure everyone respected but no one dared approach. Yet as he stood by Mia's bedside, a strange feeling crept into his heart, a feeling he couldn't explain, rooted in the whispers she had uttered in her delirium. Suddenly Mia stirred faintly. Her eyes opened slowly, hazy as if stepping out of a long dream. The room's light made her blink, then her gaze settled on Jim's face. She looked at him, her eyes tired but gentle, as if searching for something familiar amid the fragments of her memory. Her voice was weak, hoarse after days in a coma. "Who are you? Why do you feel so familiar to me?" Jim froze, his hands pausing midair, his eyes meeting hers in a moment of surprise. He replied, his voice low and cold as usual. "I'm your doctor. Do you know me?" Mia shook her head slightly, a faint smile crossing her lips, like pale sunlight on a winter day. "No, but I dreamed of someone named Jim. Maybe it was you." Her words were soft, tinged with a hint of confusion, as if she were still lost between reality and a dream. Jim frowned, setting the chart down on the edge of the bed. He repeated, his tone even but unable to hide a trace of curiosity. "You called the name Jim many times in your delirium. Who was that?" Mia froze, her gaze drifting far away, as if pulled back to a place she didn't want to recall. She sighed, a heavy breath carrying old pain. "That was Jim Carter, my ex-boyfriend." She paused, her eyes clouding with tears, then looked at him. "Your name is Jim, too? That's strange." Jim nodded slightly, saying nothing more, but his eyes lingered on her face longer than usual. Mia pursed her lips, trying to sit up, but her body was too weak. Jim reached out to support her, his movement swift yet unexpectedly gentle. "Don't move too much," he said, his voice still cold but laced with a hint of concern he didn't notice himself. Mia leaned back against the pillow, breathing heavily, then began to speak, her voice choked as if each word were a cut in her heart. "I loved him for 6 years. I tried to keep him, tried everything to make him happy. But he said he needed someone else, someone more suitable. I ran after him, begged him to stay, but he still left. And then I had the accident." Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She looked at Jim, her eyes piercing through him, as if speaking to herself. "I thought if I tried hard enough, he'd stay. But maybe love can't just come from one side." Her words burst forth in the quiet space, carrying the pain she'd held tight during her days in a coma. Jim stayed silent, listening, his eyes gradually losing their usual coldness. He wasn't used to facing such raw emotion, but Mia's voice, weak, sincere, and full of hurt, made it impossible for him to remain detached. He responded, his voice low but firm. "You survived, and that's what matters." His words were simple, yet they were like a lifeline amid the stormy waves of Mia's soul. She looked at him, her eyes brightening through the tears, as if glimpsing a faint ray of hope. "Maybe surviving was so I could learn to let go and find myself again." She smiled, her first smile since waking, weak but vibrant, like a flower blooming in the cold of winter. Jim didn't reply, only nodding slightly, but his eyes didn't leave her. He felt a strange connection, not because of the shared name, but because of the sincerity in every word she spoke. He turned away, jotting something on the chart, but his hand trembled faintly, a small sign he couldn't control. Mia watched his back, whispering to herself, "He's cold, but why do I feel like he understands me?" Nurse Lily entered the room shortly after, carrying a tray of supplies. She looked at Mia, smiling. "You're awake. You've had the whole hospital buzzing because you kept calling Dr. Marshall's name." Mia blushed, shaking her head. "I didn't know. I just remember dreaming about Jim." Jim Carter. I didn't mean to cause such a fuss. Lily chuckled softly. It's fine. Maybe you called the right person after all. She glanced at Jim, her eyes full of implication, but Jim only frowned, saying nothing. When Lily left, the room sank back into silence. Mia gazed out the window, where faint sunlight filtered through the autumn trees. She thought of Jim Carter, of the pain she once thought she'd never overcome. But now in this room, beside a stranger who somehow brought her an odd sense of safety, she felt something shifting inside her. Maybe you're right, she said softly, her voice like a breeze. Surviving is what matters, and maybe it's so I can start over. Jim turned back, his eyes meeting hers once more. He didn't speak, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but a sign of warmth creeping into his frozen heart. He stepped out of the room, leaving Mia with her thoughts. Yet in his mind, a question began to form. Who is she to make me feel this way? Outside the window, golden leaves fell silently, as if carrying Mia's old pain away. In that moment, she grasped her first lesson. Love cannot be forced, and sometimes surviving isn't just about existing. It's about rediscovering oneself and perhaps meeting someone new. Chapter 5. Growing Closer. The months after Mia Anderson awoke from her coma were a long journey of recovery, not just for her body, but for her broken heart as well. In the small hospital room at Central Chicago Hospital, the faint winter sunlight gradually replaced the golden autumn days, streaming through the window and illuminating Mia's face, now less pale. She was still weak, still confined to the hospital for months to heal the wounds from the horrific accident. But with each passing day, she felt herself coming back to life. Not merely to exist, but to discover something new in her life. Dr. James Jim Marshall, the hospital's cold ice king, became an indispensable part of that journey. He wasn't just her doctor, he was the silent presence by her side every day. He came to check on her at set times, his hands in the white lab coat moving with precision and care. His deep blue eyes always focused, but gradually shedding the icy edge that once made others wary. He tended to her with a thoughtfulness he didn't even realize, like being by her side had become an essential habit. One early morning, as dawn just broke, Jim entered the room with a tray of supplies in hand. Mia was sitting propped against her pillow, her eyes gazing out the window where the first snowflakes fell silently. He cleared his throat softly, signaling his presence. I need to change your bandages. Mia turned to him, smiling faintly. You again? I'm starting to think you never rest. Jim didn't respond, only bent down to remove the old bandage from her shoulder. His hands moved gently, so careful that they barely touched her skin more than necessary. Mia watched him, then said softly, her voice tender, You change bandages so gently, like you're afraid of hurting me. Jim paused for a second, a flicker of surprise crossing his eyes before he returned to his calm demeanor. He replied, his voice low but no longer as stern as before. I don't want anyone to hurt more than they already have. The words were simple, but to Mia, they were like a warm breeze passing through her heart, a heart once accustomed to Jim Carter's cold, empty promises. She looked at him, her eyes brightening. You're not like other doctors. You make me feel safe. Jim didn't answer, continuing his task, but the corner of his mouth twitched, a small sign of warmth he rarely revealed. In the days that followed, Jim's presence became an essential part of Mia's life in the hospital. He didn't just change her bandages or check her health. He stayed a little longer each time she needed to talk. One afternoon, as Mia held a book he'd brought her, a romantic novel he claimed he'd found in the break room, she looked up at him. I didn't expect you to like reading this kind of thing. I thought you only read medical books. Jim shrugged, his tone dry. I don't read them. I just thought you'd like it. But his eyes, watching her flip through the pages, carried a quiet care he couldn't conceal. The true moment of connection came on a late night when the hospital was steeped in silence. Mia couldn't sleep, the pain of old memories surging back into her heart. When Jim entered for his final check of the shift, he found her curled up on the bed, her eyes red. He stopped, his voice low. Are you okay? Mia shook her head, tears rolling down her cheeks. I miss him, Jim Carter. I know he doesn't deserve it, but I still miss him. Jim didn't say anything at first. He pulled a chair over and sat beside her bed, a rare action compared to his usual cold demeanor. He listened silently as Mia spoke of the days she loved Jim Carter, the sacrifices she made, and the pain when he abandoned her. "I called out to him in my dreams," she whispered, her voice choked. "But when I woke up, I saw you, and I wasn't afraid anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. Her words were like a small stone dropping into the still lake of Jim's heart. He looked at her, and for the first time, a smile flickered across his lips. Not radiant, but warm and genuine, like moonlight breaking through the night. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice low but gentle. "I'm here." In that moment, an invisible thread seemed to tie them together, not with vows or promises, but with simple sincerity. From then on, their relationship began to shift. Mia started looking forward to Jim's visits, not just because he was her doctor, but because his presence brought her a peace she'd never felt with Jim Carter. One time, when he brought her a cup of hot tea instead of the usual water, she smiled. "Are you taking care of me or spoiling me?" Jim shrugged. "Call it both." But his eyes, watching her sip the tea, lit up in a way he didn't even notice. Mia's feelings for Jim Marshall grew through the little things. She noticed his dedication, how he always checked her wounds thoroughly, how he stood quietly by the window when she slept so as not to disturb her, and how he answered her silly questions without ever getting annoyed. One evening, as he sat by her bed reading reports under the dim light, Mia asked softly, "Have you ever thought about loving someone?" Jim paused, looking at her. "I'm not good at that." Mia smiled faintly. "I thought the same, but now I'm starting to believe real love is when two people turn toward each other." Her words were like a breeze brushing through Jim's heart. He didn't reply, just looked at her, his deep eyes seeming to want to say something he couldn't voice. From Jim Carter, Mia had only received empty promises and coldness. But with Jim Marshall, she felt a silent sincerity. No words needed, just actions. She thought to herself, "Love isn't desperate clinging, it's the harmony of two hearts." And he's teaching me that. The months in the hospital were no longer a burden to Mia. Each day with Jim made her feel stronger, not just physically, but in her soul. Once, as he helped her stand to practice walking, his hand gripping hers tightly, she whispered, "Thank you for being here." Jim looked at her, his voice low. "You don't need to thank me. I want to be here." The words weren't ornate, but to Mia they were like an unspoken promise. Outside the window, snow fell thicker, blanketing Chicago in white. In the small room, two once strangers were gradually becoming part of each other. Mia no longer called out to Jim in her dreams. She called him with her heart, and for the first time she felt that love wasn't pain, but hope. Chapter 6. Overcoming the Misunderstanding. The final days of winter in Chicago brought a biting cold, but inside Mia Anderson's room at Central Chicago Hospital, the atmosphere grew warmer than ever. Snow fell outside the window, blanketing the bare trees in white, but within, the soft glow of a small bedside lamp illuminated Mia's face, now rosier after months of recovery. She sat on the bed, holding the novel Jim Marshall had once brought her eyes occasionally drifting into the distance, as if pondering something deep within her heart. Jim's presence, the cold but devoted doctor, had become her greatest comfort, a small, smoldering flame lighting up her darkest days. Yet within the hospital, rumors about the relationship between Mia and Jim continued to spread quietly. Each time Jim entered the room, the staff's eyes turned to him, accompanied by whispers. "The Ice King seems different now," or "She called his name in her dreams. There's got to be something special there." The misunderstanding that Jim Marshall was the Jim in Mia's heart had turned into a romantic tale that everyone in the hospital enjoyed discussing. Only Jim knew the truth. He wasn't the one she called out to in her delirium. But he never explained much, merely denying it silently. "I'm not that person." The truth came to light one late afternoon when Nurse Lily stepped into Mia's room with a radiant smile. She had just spoken with a colleague in the ER who had overheard the story from the rescue team that brought Mia to the hospital. "Mia," Lily said, her voice brimming with excitement, "I just found out something. The Jim you called out to in your delirium wasn't Dr. Marshall. It was Jim Carter, your ex-boyfriend, right? Mia looked up from her book, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, then nodded slowly. Yeah, it was him. I didn't realize I'd called his name so much. Lily sat down beside the bed, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. We've been misunderstanding Dr. Marshall this whole time. Everyone thought he was your Jim, but it turns out he's not. I talked to him this morning, and I apologize for letting this misunderstanding drag on. Mia smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in her eyes. It's okay, Lily. I didn't expect to cause such a mess either. Lily tilted her head, looking at her with sincerity. But you know, Mia, you're special. I've seen how Dr. Marshall takes care of you. He's not just doing his job. He genuinely cares. Don't let him slip away, okay? Lily's words rippled gently through Mia, stirring emotions she hadn't yet dared to face. The news spread quickly throughout the hospital. In the staff break room, conversations grew livelier. An older nurse, Helen, held her coffee cup and said with a touched tone, I saw him stand by her bed all night when she had a high fever. The Ice King isn't cold anymore. Another younger nurse, Sarah, giggled. Maybe he was never cold. No one just had the patience to melt the ice. Mia heard these remarks from Lily and couldn't help but smile. She thought of Jim Marshall, the man with sharp, cold eyes but gentle hands, the one who stayed by her side without needing promises. One evening, as he entered the room for his final check of the shift, Mia looked at him, her eyes shining. I heard they call you the Ice King, but I think maybe he was never cold. It's just that no one reached his heart before. Jim paused, his eyes meeting hers in a quiet moment. He didn't answer right away, bending down to check her IV line, but when he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. Maybe you're right, or maybe I just didn't know my heart could still feel warmth. The words weren't ornate, but to Mia they felt like a silent confession, making her heart beat faster. The misunderstanding had been cleared, but it didn't diminish their bond. On the contrary, it was like a door opening for them to understand each other more. The staff began to see Jim differently. Helen, who had once thought him an unfeeling man, now said to Lily, I've never seen him care for anyone like that. This girl has changed him. Lily nodded. I think they've changed each other. She brings light and he gives her strength. Once when Jim brought Mia a cup of hot tea, a habit he'd kept since her weaker days, she took his hand, her voice trembling slightly. Thank you, not just for saving me, but for being here with me. Jim looked at her, his hand gently squeezing hers, his voice low. I'm not good at saying thanks, but I want you here too, with me. In that moment, under the dim glow of the lamp and the sound of snow falling outside, they felt a connection that went beyond words. The misunderstanding about the name Jim no longer mattered. For Mia, Jim Marshall wasn't the one she'd called out to in her delirium, but he had become the one she wanted to call with her heart. For Jim, Mia was more than a patient. She was the first person to make him feel his heart wasn't frozen anymore. The staff stopped whispering about an imagined love story and started believing in something real blossoming between the two. That night, as Jim stood by the window in Mia's room, watching the snow fall silently, he heard her say softly from the bed, Do you believe in fate? Jim turned back, his eyes gentler than ever. I didn't before, but now I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong. Mia smiled, her eyes sparkling in the moonlight. Me too, and I'm glad for it. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything like a promise of a fresh start. The misunderstanding had dissolved, leaving behind a clearer truth than ever. Between Mia and Jim, an invisible bond had formed, not from whispers and dreams, but from the moments they walked through pain together and found each other. Chapter 7. The Past Returns. Winter in Chicago grew harsher, with cold winds swirling snow across the road, leading to Central Chicago Hospital. Inside Mia Anderson's hospital room, the warmth from the bedside lamp and Jim Marshall's presence had become a safe haven for her during her recovery days. Mia was stronger now, her hands no longer trembled when holding a book, and her eyes lit up each time Jim entered the room. But just as she began to feel a new spark of hope beside him, the past unexpectedly knocked, bringing back a figure she thought had left her forever. One late afternoon, as the faint sunset faded behind the towering buildings, the door to her room creaked open. Mia looked up, expecting Jim Marshall to come check on her as usual, but it wasn't him who stepped inside. It was Jim Carter, her ex-boyfriend, the man who had once been her entire world before abandoning her without a word. He stood there in his familiar black suit, his slicked-back hair still glossy, but his brown eyes, once cold, now brimmed with regret. "Mia," he said, his voice trembling as he stepped closer to her bed. "I was wrong. I need you." Mia froze, her hand gripping the edge of the blanket tightly, a wave of turmoil flashing through her eyes. 6 years of loving him, the days she waited, the times she cried silently for him, all came rushing back like a nightmare she tried to forget. But she was no longer the weak girl from back then. She looked at him, her voice quiet but resolute. "You were once my whole world, Jim. I ran after you, begged you to stay, but you left, and now I'm not the girl waiting for you to come back anymore." Her words cut like an invisible knife, not to hurt him, but to sever the last thread lingering in her heart. Jim Carter knelt beside the bed, grasping her hand, his voice pleading. "I know I was foolish. I lost you once, and I don't want to lose you forever. Give me a chance, Mia." But Mia pulled her hand back, her eyes free of tears, holding only the calm of someone who had moved past the pain. "You didn't lose me, Jim. You chose to walk away from me, and I've learned to live without you." At that moment, Jim Marshall stood outside the door, holding the patient status chart. He had come to check on Mia as usual, but hearing Jim Carter's voice and her response stopped him cold. "You were once my whole world." Those words echoed in his mind, piercing his heart like a needle. He didn't hear the full conversation, assuming Mia still longed for that other man, that the moments between him and her were just a temporary substitute. Jim clenched the chart tightly, his eyes darkening, then turned away silently, keeping his distance from her from that moment on. In the days that followed, Mia noticed the change in Jim Marshall. He still came to check on her, but he no longer lingered as he once did. His words were brief, his eyes avoided meeting hers, and his hands no longer brought her hot tea or books. Mia felt a growing emptiness in her heart, as if she were losing something vital she hadn't yet grasped. She asked Lily, her voice anxious, "Is something wrong with him? I feel like he's pulling away from me." Lily shrugged, but a hint of suspicion flickered in her eyes. "I'm not sure, but maybe he overheard something when Jim Carter was here." Mia understood. She realized Jim Marshall had misheard part of the conversation, and she couldn't let that misunderstanding destroy what they had built. One evening, as the snow fell thicker outside the window, Mia resolved to confront him. She asked Lily to wheel her to Jim's office, where he sat alone, the dim light casting shadows on his cold face. When the door opened, Jim looked up, surprise flashing in his eyes. "You shouldn't be out of bed." Mia shook her head, her voice trembling slightly. "I had to see you. I can't let you distance yourself from me without knowing why." Jim stayed silent, his gaze shifting away, but Mia pressed on. She took a deep breath, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You heard what I said to Jim Carter, didn't you? You think I still miss him?" Jim didn't answer, but his hand tightened around the pen on the desk, a sign he was holding something back. Mia continued, her voice choked but firm. "I don't hurt over Jim Carter anymore, Jim. He was once my whole world, but that world collapsed long ago. The accident taught me that when one door closes, I have to find another. And you're the light I saw." She paused, tears falling harder. "I don't want to lose you, not because you're my doctor, but because you're the one who made me believe in love again." Her words were like a gust of wind blowing away the last layer of ice in Jim's heart. He stood, stepping toward her, his eyes no longer cold but brimming with emotion. He knelt before her wheelchair, his hands grasping hers, his voice low but trembling. "I thought you still loved him. I was afraid I wasn't enough to replace him in your heart." Mia shook her head, her tears falling onto his hands. "You don't need to replace anyone. You're you, the one I need." Jim pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if afraid she'd vanish if he let go. His heart, frozen for years, melted completely in her embrace. He whispered in her ear, I'm not good at saying I love you, but I don't want to lose you. Mia rested her head on his shoulder, smiling through her tears. Then don't leave me, just as I won't leave you. In that moment, amid the silent snowfall outside the window, all barriers from Mia's past and Jim's misunderstanding dissolved. She grasped the deepest lesson. Love isn't about clinging one-sidedly, but about both opening their hearts and stepping toward each other. With Jim Carter, she had chased in desperation, but with Jim Marshall, she found a place to rest, not to wait, but to build together. When Lily returned to take Mia back to her room, she paused outside the door, smiling as she saw them embracing. She whispered to herself, "The Ice King has truly melted, and she's the only one who could do it." Outside, the snow still fell, but inside the small room, a new spring began to bloom in the hearts of two once-lost souls. Mia no longer looked to the past, and Jim no longer hid behind his icy shell. They had found each other, not through fate, but through sincerity and trust. Chapter 8. Realizing Feelings. Spring in Chicago brought a gentle warmth, but in Mia Anderson's room at Central Chicago Hospital, the atmosphere still carried a hint of heaviness from the days she fought her injuries. Mia had grown stronger, able to sit up on her own and take a few steps with the walker Jim Marshall had brought her. She felt a change within herself, not just physically but in her heart, thanks to Jim, who was always by her side with silent devotion. Yet their feelings, though deepening day by day, had not yet been named with words. That night the hospital was quiet, with only the distant sound of night shift staff footsteps echoing. Mia sat on her bed, the dim glow of the bedside lamp illuminating her face, where her brown eyes now shone brighter. The water pitcher on the bedside table was empty, and her throat felt parched. Jim had left after the afternoon shift, saying he'd return in the morning, but Mia didn't want to bother a nurse over something small. "I can do it," she told herself, gripping the walker and resolving to fetch water from the large jug in the corner of the room. Her legs trembled, each step a challenge, but Mia clenched her teeth, her gaze determined. She moved slowly, her breathing labored, reaching out for the jug. But just as she touched it, her legs gave way. The sound of the jug crashing rang out in the silent room, followed by the thud of her falling to the floor. Pain shot from her shoulder down to her legs. She tried to push herself up, but her body wouldn't obey. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not from the pain, but from the helplessness. At that moment, Jim Marshall pushed the door open. He wasn't on the night shift, but an uneasy feeling had driven him back to the hospital. When he saw Mia on the floor, the jug rolling beside her, his heart felt like it shattered. "Mia!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic, rushing to her side. He knelt down, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her with urgency yet gentleness. "Are you crazy? Why didn't you call me?" he asked, his voice shaking, his deep blue eyes brimming with fear. Mia looked up at him, tears still falling, but she gave a weak smile. "I didn't want to bother you." Her words were soft, but they stopped Jim's breath for a moment. He held her tighter, helping her back to the bed, laying her down and pulling the blanket over her. He sat beside her, clutching her hand, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're never a bother," he said, his voice hoarse. "I can't stand it if you get hurt. Not even once more." In that moment, gazing into Mia's red, teary eyes, Jim realized he loved her. It wasn't because of a doctor's duty or pity, but because his heart, long frozen, beat fiercely just to keep her safe. He leaned down, resting his forehead against her hand, whispering, "I can't lose you, Mia." It was the first time he let emotion override reason, and he knew this love was no longer something he could hide. That night, Jim didn't leave. He stayed the entire night, sitting by her bed, holding her hand tightly as if afraid she'd fall again if he let go. Mia drifted off from exhaustion, but when she woke in the middle of the night, she saw him still there, his tired but gentle eyes fixed on her. She looked at him, her voice a faint breeze. "You've taught me that love takes effort from both sides." Jim looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and he nodded slightly. "And I'll keep trying for you, forever." A clear spring night in Chicago followed, the full moon shining brightly through the window of Mia's hospital room. She had nearly fully recovered, able to walk without the aid of a walker. Jim entered, not in his lab coat but in a simple light blue shirt, his eyes lighting up as he looked at her. Would you like to step outside for a bit? Mia nodded, her heart racing as he took her hand, leading her to the small garden behind the hospital. They sat on a wooden bench under the moonlight, their hands intertwined, the quiet space filled only with the sound of the spring breeze. Mia looked up at him. I never thought I'd be sitting here with you, like this. Jim turned to her, his gaze deep. Neither did I. But there's nowhere else I'd rather be than here, with you. Jim took a deep breath, his hand tightening around hers, then said, his voice low and trembling, Mia, I don't want you to call any other Jim, but me. His words were like a declaration, laying bare all the feelings he'd kept inside. Mia looked at him, tears streaming down her face, but she smiled. Because you're the Jim I want to turn to. Her reply was a promise, affirming that he was the one she chose to love. Jim raised his hand, wiping the tears from her cheek, his trembling fingers brushing her skin. I love you, he whispered, his voice hoarse, for a long time now. Mia closed her eyes, leaning into his hand, and he leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a gentle, profound kiss. That kiss marked their faithful love, a wordless vow beneath the bright silver moonlight. Chapter 9. New Happiness. After being discharged from the hospital, Mia and Jim lived together in a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, where wildflowers grew along the roadside and summer sunlight streamed through the windows. Their life was simple but filled with love. Jim became more open, often smiling when Mia busied herself in the kitchen or pulled him out to the balcony to stargaze. One time he hugged her from behind, whispering, You've changed me. Mia leaned into him, smiling. We've changed each other. Jim Carter occasionally watched them from a distance, seeing Mia laugh beside Jim Marshall, his eyes full of regret but with no chance to intrude. He turned away, leaving behind a past Mia no longer looked back on. One evening, sitting beside Jim on the balcony, Mia thought to herself, losing him was what led me to true happiness. She held Jim's hand, knowing this was where she belonged. A year later, under the canopy of autumn trees in Chicago, Mia and Jim got married. Golden leaves fell like a natural carpet, tiny lights twinkling on the branches. Mia, in a white wedding dress, and Jim in a black suit, exchanged vows beneath the sunset. Mia said, You are my light. Jim replied, You are everything to me. At the wedding reception, Mia shared with their friends, A relationship needs both people to be faithful and turn toward each other. When one door closes, don't be afraid, another will open. Jim embraced her, his eyes shining with love. They spread their happiness through charity work, helping the community together, living a fulfilled life under the moonlight and golden leaves. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.